What if the tantrum isn't defiance, but a flare gun from a child lost in the fog of their own terror? We live in a culture quick to assign moral weight to children's behavior. A child who yells, hits, lies, or withdraws is often labeled as difficult, spoiled, or even bad. But these labels conceal more than they reveal. What if, beneath the defiance, there is not a will to disrupt, but a desperate effort to survive? Children are not miniature adults with fully developed reasoning or emotional regulation. They are fragile beings whose inner worlds are still forming, still learning how to interpret sensation, emotion, and the complex demands of adults around them. A child who lashes out may not be rebelling. They may be overwhelmed, overstimulated, or terrified in ways they cannot name. What looks like manipulation may be a clumsy attempt to secure love or avoid rejection. James Hillman once said, "We've had 100 years of psychotherapy, and the world's getting worse because we still see the symptom, not the soul." When a child screams, isolates, or lies, we tend to see the behavior as the problem itself. But depth psychology urges us to look beneath the symptom, to the soul's attempt to signal distress. Children's so-called bad behavior is often a psychic shield, a protective layer crafted unconsciously to defend against shame, unpredictability, neglect, or emotional abandonment. Aggression may be an armor, silence, a refuge. The child is not attacking, they are adapting. To call a child bad is to miss the deeper truth. They are speaking in the only language their unformed psyche knows, the language of survival. And it is our task as adults to decode it not with punishment, but with presence. Freud's enduring legacy in psychology is the recognition that the human mind is not a singular rational entity, but a battleground of unconscious forces. His model of the psyche, the id, ego, and superego, offered a revolutionary framework for understanding how inner conflict shapes behavior. Within this model, defense mechanisms were seen as the ego's tools for managing tension between instinctual drives, id, and societal or parental expectations, superego. These defenses, repression, denial, projection, displacement, and others, are often thought of in adult terms. But in truth, children deploy these psychic strategies far earlier than we assume. A toddler who breaks a toy and insists, "It wasn't me," may be using denial or repression, not because they wish to deceive, but because the anxiety of blame or punishment feels existentially overwhelming. A 5-year-old who blames their sibling for a mess they made may be projecting their fear of being bad onto someone else, as a way to preserve their fragile sense of worth. A child who throws a tantrum after school may be displacing the frustration they couldn't express to an intimidating teacher. These are not calculated misbehaviors, but instinctive responses. The early stirrings of an unconscious mind trying to stay afloat in the face of emotional confusion and threat. Freud was right in identifying that the mind defends itself. But where he framed defense mechanisms largely as signs of neurotic conflict, depth psychology invites us to go further. These defenses are not flaws, but functions of an evolving psyche. They reveal a child's intuitive grasp that the world can be dangerous or disorienting, and that inner peace sometimes demands outer performance. Yet Freud's theory, while structurally elegant, was never fully equipped to address the symbolic or soulful dimensions of these defenses. In his framework, the mind is a machine balancing pressures, but in the world of the child, the psyche is more like a stage, a place where fear, desire, love, and shame wear costumes and act out dramas long before language can name them. A child's lie may be more than avoidance. It may be a psychic myth, a survival story they must tell themselves to stay emotionally coherent in a world they cannot control. This is where Jung and Hillman extend the conversation. For Jung, the psyche is teleological. It wants to become whole. For Hillman, symptoms are not obstacles to cure, but expressions of soul. From these perspectives, even the earliest defense mechanisms are not simply ways to avoid pain. They are creative attempts to preserve psychic continuity, to maintain a foothold in a world that often seems too vast, too chaotic, or too indifferent. Thus, when a child resists, denies, or blames, we ought to ask not just, what are they avoiding, but what are they protecting? And deeper still, what story is their soul trying to tell us through this behavior? Freud opened the door. But to truly understand children, we must walk further into the house. In Jungian psychology, The psyche is not a blank slate gradually inscribed by environment and experience, but a living landscape patterned by timeless images, archetypes, that emerge across cultures, dreams, myths, and individual lives. Among these archetypes, the wounded child holds particular power. Far from being a mere stage of development, this figure represents a core pattern of human suffering and resilience that shapes our emotional lives from early childhood well into adulthood. The wounded child appears in myths as the abandoned infant, the neglected royal heir, the exiled innocent, Dionysus torn apart and reborn, Moses set adrift in a basket, the Christ child born in a manger. These stories endure not because they are ancient, but because they are true in the language of the soul. According to Jung, archetypes do not just reside in the unconscious, they structure it. The wounded child is one such structuring principle. It governs how we respond to pain, how we perceive abandonment, and how we carry vulnerability through the rest of our lives. The child who is not seen, not heard, or not mirrored adequately by caregivers may internalize not only a sense of deficiency but also a myth. I am unworthy, I must not feel, or I must protect myself at all costs. These are not simply beliefs, they are narratives the psyche constructs around the wounded child. When activated, this archetype influences adult behavior in subtle and profound ways. It can manifest as perfectionism, people-pleasing, aggression, withdrawal, or chronic mistrust. And yet the wounded child is not only a source of dysfunction, it is also the wellspring of empathy, creativity, and depth. Jung also described the divine child, a symbol of the emergent self, the nucleus of potential and wholeness. This figure is radiant, innocent, resilient, capable of transformation. But the divine child is often buried beneath the shadow. The parts of the psyche we repress because they are painful or socially unacceptable. When caregivers are attuned, consistent, and emotionally available, the divine child can flourish, giving rise to confidence and curiosity. But when a child is shamed, ignored, or traumatized, the shadow child emerges, mistrustful, angry, closed off, or explosively reactive. Neither state is permanent, but both are deeply archetypal. The beauty of the archetypal view is that it refuses to reduce children to clinical labels or behavioral profiles. Instead, it recognizes that every child embodies a drama far older and deeper than their personal biography. The child is not simply learning to adapt, they are enacting a myth. When we see a child who is distant, volatile, or destructive, we are witnessing the cry of the wounded child. Not a problem to be solved, but a soul trying to make itself known. To engage with a child at this level is not to fix them, but to witness them, to enter into relationship with their wound as a living symbol. Jung's deeper mirror reveals what our culture often forgets, that behind every outburst or silence may lie a sacred story waiting to be heard. Not all wounds scream. Some whisper through clenched jaws, slammed doors, withdrawn eyes, or tightly crossed arms. In the world of children, pain rarely arrives with clarity. Instead, it wraps itself in layers of anger, defiance, distraction, or control. To the untrained eye, this looks like misbehavior. But in the lens of trauma-informed psychology, these behaviors are not problems to eliminate. They are armors the psyche crafts to survive unseen wounds. While the word trauma often conjures images of catastrophic events, many of the deepest injuries in a child's world are subtle, invisible, and chronic. Repeated misattunement, when caregivers fail to notice or validate the child's inner state, can erode a sense of worth just as powerfully as overt harm. A parent too absorbed in their own anxieties or too quick to punish a child's tears may inadvertently teach that emotions are dangerous, unacceptable, or unworthy of attention. These early emotional betrayals are encoded not in memory, but in behavior. A child who lashes out may not be trying to dominate, but trying desperately not to feel the shame of being dismissed or misunderstood. A child who lies may not be deceitful by nature, but terrified of rejection if they tell the truth. Behind the behavior is a strategy of self-protection. Better to act out and control the environment than to risk the raw, unbearable sensation of being unlovable. James Hillman challenged the therapeutic world to move beyond pathologizing, to stop viewing symptoms as deviations from the norm, and instead see them as expressions of soul in hiding. He wrote, "Symptoms speak the language of the soul and evoke the response from the soul. A child's aggression, then, is not simply a failure of discipline or character. It is a cry encrypted in symbolic form. It says, "Don't see me weak. Don't see me shamed. See my rage instead." Shame is perhaps the most corrosive of all psychic injuries because it attacks the self at its root. While fear says, "I might be hurt," shame whispers, "I am the problem." And so, children who feel chronic shame, whether from criticism, neglect, or emotional coldness, learn to construct defenses that protect them from ever touching that unbearable core. These defenses may appear as boldness, rebellion, arrogance, or coldness. But they are shields, not truths. Understanding this does not mean we excuse harmful behavior. Rather, it asks us to respond from the soul instead of the surface. When we encounter a child's armor, we should not ask, "How do I stop this behavior?" But instead, what is this child protecting? What would happen if this armor fell away? To meet children at this level requires patience, presence, and the willingness to see through the behavior into the hidden wound beneath. It means becoming less concerned with compliance and more committed to connection. Only then can the child begin to remove their armor, not because we force them to, but because they finally feel safe enough to be seen. James Hillman asked us to abandon the obsession with fixing people, especially children. To Hillman, every attempt to correct a behavior risks misunderstanding its purpose, mistaking a sacred signal for a mechanical error. In his archetypal psychology, Hillman proposes a radical alternative. Instead of pathologizing the child, we must learn to imagine them. Their actions, no matter how disruptive, are not mechanical malfunctions, but symbolic gestures of the soul. Dramatized messages trying to speak through the only language available, behavior. Unlike traditional psychologies that strive for adjustment and normalization, Hillman's view honors the soul's complexity. He sees the psyche not as a linear narrative, but as polytheistic, filled with many voices, moods, and gods. The soul is not a singular self marching toward wholeness. It is a drama, shifting, imagistic, metaphorical. A child who is wild, loud, or melancholic is not wrong, but inhabiting a psychic landscape that needs to be named and mirrored, not managed or erased. Imagine a boy who growls and throws things when asked to do his homework. Instead of seeing disobedience, Hillman might see Ares, the god of war, raw, reactive, and full of fight. Or a girl who retreats into silence and fantasy may be in the grip of Hecate, goddess of the threshold and mystery. Archetypal psychology doesn't reduce these behaviors to diagnostic categories. It amplifies them through myth, giving them depth and dignity. What does it mean to respond to children in this way? It means replacing the clinical question, "What's wrong with this child?" with the mythopoetic inquiry, "What image is this child carrying? What God is speaking through this mood? What story is the symptom trying to tell?" In this light, symptoms become symbols. A child's refusal to speak may not be defiance, but an initiation into the power of silence. Hyperactivity might be an expression of Hermes, the divine trickster and restless communicator. Rather than forcing conformity, adults are invited to enter the symbolic field, to listen through the behavior to what the soul is asking for. Healing, in this framework, is not about restoring normalcy. It is about restoring imagination. The child does not need to be shaped into a better version of themselves. They need to be mirrored in a way that affirms their complexity. This requires adults who are willing to feel, to wonder, and to relinquish control over the child's inner process. Hillman writes, "The soul has reasons that reason cannot know." To work with children soulfully is to resist the impulse to diagnose or explain too quickly. It means sitting with mystery. It means understanding that transformation often begins not in correction, but in creative attention. When we see behavior as image, rich, meaningful, archetypal, we offer children something they rarely receive in a clinical world, the dignity of their inner life. And in that space, healing can begin. Not as a cure, but as a deepening. Not as a solution, but as a soulful unfolding. Too often, adults interpret a child's behavior as a threat to control, rather than a call for connection. The instinctive response is to correct, punish, or withdraw. But when we understand behavior as a symbolic language, when we see tantrums, lies, defiance, or withdrawal not as defiance, but as expressions of need or distress, then our responsibility shifts. We are no longer jailers enforcing order. We become witnesses, interpreters, and companions on the child's emotional journey. To shift from discipline to dialogue is not to abandon boundaries. It is to enforce them with curiosity and containment, not fear or shame. Children don't need us to be permissive. They need us to be emotionally present and regulated. They need adults who can stay calm in the storm, not because the storm isn't real, but because someone must hold the center when they can't. This begins with active listening, a principle rooted in both Jungian therapy and trauma-informed care. When a child is in distress, we resist the urge to lecture or fix. Instead, we mirror their feeling. "I can see how angry you are. That must have felt really scary when she said that. You're trying to tell me something big with your body. I'm here to listen." These simple acknowledgments do not excuse harmful behavior, but they validate the emotional root beneath it. They show the child that their inner world matters and that their feelings don't need to be hidden behind armor. Another tool is narrative reframing, helping the child reshape the story they're telling themselves. A boy who says, "I'm bad because I hit," might be gently guided to, "You hit because you felt cornered and didn't know what else to do. That doesn't make you bad. It means we need to find other ways to feel safe." Here, we teach accountability without collapsing identity into action. We distinguish between what you did and who you are. Co-regulation is equally essential. A dysregulated adult cannot soothe a dysregulated child. Through breath, tone, and posture, we invite the child into our nervous system's rhythm. We slow down, soften our eyes, and become the container they can't yet be for themselves. This is not weakness, it is profound strength, the ability to stay with the child's chaos without adding our own. Caregivers must also confront their own projections. What in the child triggers your anger, your fear, your helplessness? Often the child mirrors a part of ourselves we've rejected. In these moments, healing is twofold, between adult and child and within the adult themselves. No method is perfect. There will be days of rupture, of failure, of raised voices and closed doors. But if we return, if we repair, if we keep choosing relationship over reactivity, the child learns a new truth. I can be messy and still be loved. Because in the end, as Hillman and Jung both understood, what the child needs is not perfection, but presence. No child wants to be bad. They only want to be seen, heard, and held by someone strong enough to stay.